Hello, I'm Ellie Akra, and welcome to this week's special edition of Watching Washington. Today, we'll be recapping the midterm election, discussing the results we've received so far, the results we've yet to receive, our analysis, and the implications. I'm joined by Avik Patel, Juntong Liu, Sean English, and Gabriella Chu. Let's start with where control of Congress sits today. Republicans are now one seat away, as of the date of this recording, from winning the House, though by a slim margin. They're likely to take control in the next few days, but when it comes to the Senate, the Democrats have retained control at a current 50-49 count, with one more seat up for grabs in the Georgia runoff. Going into this election, this is not what Republicans anticipated, or most Democrats for that matter. What is your thoughts?
Well, obviously the Democrats exceeded expectations in the House of Representatives, and they maintained a slim margin in the Senate. Objectively, Congress still looks just as divided as it did before the midterm elections. So it'll be interesting to see what Congress accomplishes within the next 2 years and how much President Biden will be able to accomplish for that matter, and whether or not that will influence him to run again.
Yep.
Yeah, I completely agree. I thought this would be a big surprise for a lot of people looking at this, and it's kind of more divided than anyone kind of anticipated. So I'm really curious to see how this comes down now that we're down to the wire right now.
Yeah, and even on election night, the results weren't totally clear as they are now. And on election night, I think a lot of people still thought that it was going to go to Republican majority, as it typically does. History's shown in the midterms, but this definitely flipped it and raises the question of, will this be the new precedent, that it may not always flip to the opposite party in power during a midterm election?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that was really the interesting aspect to this race, was seeing that it didn't really go as it normally does, which we studied, we talked about beforehand on the fact that Republicans do usually take control. And it's interesting to see that this year it didn't play out how it usually does. So going forward, I think that's something that everyone will be watching to see.
Yeah, and definitely during our show today, we will get into those factors we think led to this turn of events in the midterm elections. And one of those is the youth vote. Avik, if you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, young voters showed up to the polls in record numbers across the nation this year, especially here on our Purdue campus. Obviously, there are a lot of young voters like us who felt deeply impacted by some of the events and occurrences that happened in our nation within the last 2 years and beyond. So what have you guys seen on our campus in particular regarding how people felt about the midterms?
Well, I really wanted to ask you, because, going back to the election night broadcast, you had some of the interview panels with students, and hearing their answers and their thoughts. What do you think?
Yeah, from the students that we were able to interview on the election night broadcast that we did, a lot of them didn't really pay attention to midterms until this year. And a lot of them, that reason was issues like abortion, issues like inflation, issues that they felt that deeply impacted them, caused them to finally pay attention to the midterms and invest themselves in it and vote in them for the first time. So I really think that the impacts that issues such as abortion and inflation and gun violence, too, for that matter, have had on young people like us, the impact that it had on young people like us to make us turn out to the polls in record numbers, not just here, but around the nation, I think is definitely a huge impact in these midterms if you think about it on the grand scheme of things.
Yep.
When I had the panel with a group of students, I asked them if they vote or not. They said they said no, but they are focusing on the issues and things about the elections. So I think that's a good sign for the youth votes.
I agree. I think regardless of whether they voted or not, because there were quite a few people who they said they cared and we asked and they didn't vote. But the fact that people are paying attention and watching these issues, watching these elections, I think says a lot. And I think for the Republicans, for 2024, they're going to have to figure out a way to capture some of that youth vote. And it'll be interesting to see how they move forward with that.
Yeah.
So some of the issues that we talked about just now are what led people to vote. Gabriella, do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, two of the key issues that were discussed prior to the midterms was the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the economy, specifically inflation, like we've mentioned. The question was which one would have more of an effect on voter turnout and the results, which I think, as we said, many were surprised to see that this year it wasn't just the economy that had an effect on voter turnout. And according to CNN exit polls, early on in the election night, 31% of the voters said inflation was their top issue, and 27% said it was abortion, which I think that many were shocked to see that it was so high up, so close. And so, talking about those issues and seeing that women also constituted to about 52% of the vote, with men at 48%. And 53% of women did vote Democratic. So, talking about that and what we just said, like with the key issues, like what are your thoughts?
This is something that we talked about in our course a lot.
Mm-hmm.
The impact that women, particularly women who support Democrats, could have on these midterms. We talked about in the course, that one of the ways that Democrats could possibly maintain control of the House, much less come as close as they are now to controlling the House again, is the women vote,
Mm-hmm.
women voting, and women voting blue in particular. And I think that's what we've seen, especially in the House, given how many seats the Democrats were able to maintain and flip in the House. That's what we've been able to see in these midterms. And before election night, it was merely speculation, blue women voters might make an impact on these midterms and possibly allow the Democrats to maintain control of both houses of Congress. It certainly helped them maintain control of the Senate, and it certainly did help them come close to maintaining control of the House.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the economy was an issue that I was very focused on leading up to the election, as I talked about on election night. And going in, I thought that the economy would turn out to be the bigger issue, as that's typically what history has shown. But it was definitely proved wrong, I think. I think the voters that cared about the economy, it wasn't enough to outweigh the abortion issue,
Mm-hmm.
or they decided not to go vote. But whatever it is, I definitely think that looking back, abortion, obviously the figures have shown that it played a huge role in the midterm elections.
Yeah, it seemed like going into this election, it was abortion versus the economy. What side were you going to vote on? Is it blue? Is it red? But there are plenty of other issues that weren't previously discussed in a major way. And one of those topics was marijuana. It was on the ballot in many different places, and it had a major impact on the results of this midterm election. Maryland and Missouri approved an adult use market, but Kansas, North and South Dakota failed to pass recreational legalization. Despite mixed results, marijuana stocks had a decently sized increase just days after the midterms, and a cannabis-related ETF was up 3% the morning after the midterms. So the topic of marijuana was on the ballot, but not many people were talking about it because there's always going to be more issues to watch. But this was something that I think had a major impact on the elections, along with Roe v. Wade and the economy, and it's something that wasn't talked about.
Which
very much.
we discussed recently that we didn't even really talk about that as much. And it wasn't really until election night and the student panel and hearing them kind of mention that issue that we were like, oh, like this could be a bigger drive on like voter turnout. So I don't know. I just thought that was really interesting to hear the fact that we didn't really talk about it as much, and then it did turn out to be a bigger issue.
And I feel like between the states, it's still an issue that each state has a different stance on.
Mm-hmm.
Indiana has a different stance on marijuana than my home state of Illinois does. And you look around at all 50 of the states, and each of them have their own policies in regards to marijuana. So, yeah, it was kind of an under-talked about issue within the midterms, but when you think about it, it's been a long-standing issue for quite a while, especially within each individual state.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I definitely think while it's not an issue that we watched going into the election, I think it's one to watch coming out of the election. over the next 2 years to see if politicians decide this is something that should stay to the states. Or I know that President Biden put a tweet out leading up to the midterm elections about marijuana legalization. So it's going to be interesting to see whether, which with divided government may be difficult, but whether this stays a state issue or whether it becomes a national issue too. So definitely something to watch in the future.
One of the candidates, McDermott, he was like supporting the marijuana, and I now want to talk about their races. The election result for Todd Young versus Thomas McDermott is out. Todd Young wins the election by 58.7% votes. McDermott gains 37.9%. A few weeks ago, they had a very close percentage for their poll. Although Todd Young led the poll by 2%, but it was still hard to predict. Senator Todd Young has been the senator of Indiana for 4 years, and now he is continuing to be the senator of Indiana.
Yeah, and I thought this race was actually kind of surprising, especially starting out before election night, because I saw that polls were very close between Young and McDermott, like with literally, as you stated, within a few percentage points. So I really did not know how close or how much of a landslide it would be for either of these candidates on election night. So I was actually a little bit surprised at how well Todd Young did, given how the polls pre-election night looked.
Yeah, I definitely was surprised about the polls prior to election night. I was not as surprised as the election night result, given Indiana's status as a very red state. But leading up to the election, it was certainly interesting. And he will be continuing on in his term as senator. So in Indiana, we'll watch to see what he does. So when it comes to the Florida Senate battle between Republican Marco Rubio and Democrat Val Demings, what started again as a close race turned out to be an easy victory for Rubio, kind of a similar situation as we saw for Senator Young in Indiana and Thomas McDermott. Rubio ended up winning by 16 percentage points, which sent him to his third term in the Senate. This victory echoed the historic win of Republican Governor Ron DeSantis in the Sunshine State, who defeated his opponent by a nearly 20% margin, which was the largest margin since Jeb Bush's win by 13 percentage points in 2002. So though Florida has been a swing state for many years, it's looking to trend more Republican after the midterms.
Yeah, Rubio and Governor Ron DeSantis both played significant roles in making Florida more red. I think I was particularly surprised by how well they did in Florida. Like I had a feeling that they would win as Republicans in Florida, given that it was a purplish, like light red state. But the fact that they made it like a deep, dark red state was particularly surprising to me.
And we've discussed before on like the potential impacts of the hurricane having on these races. And with this result, do you think, studying this race more and watching it, do you think that that had an impact on it?
How vast the spread was between the two candidates, I don't believe that the hurricane really had much of an impact. We did talk about how they allowed for the absentee voting in those 3 counties that were deeply affected, and those counties were red. So I think that if it would have been 3 counties that were deeply Democrat, maybe, it would have had more of an effect on the election. But as it also turns out, DeSantis won Miami-Dade County, which is one of the dark blue counties in Florida typically. So though it has had an impact on many other things in Florida, I don't think the hurricane had much of an impact on the election results.
Honestly, I want to bring up one point. We talked about during the class, we talked about how natural disasters and man-made also disasters can impact whether or not a candidate does well or falters.
Yeah.
We've talked about how natural disasters can either A, make voters angry at current leadership, or B, inspire voters to rally around whoever is in current leadership. It really depends on the response of the current leadership during the disaster. And so I think one thing that I just thought of is that maybe Florida voters rallied around Governor DeSantis and Senator Rubio following the hurricane. Maybe Governor DeSantis and Senator Rubio did well enough in response to the hurricane in the eyes of voters to inspire them to rally around those two candidates rather than make them feel angry towards them and vote them out.
Yeah, that's a very fair point that I didn't think of, but definitely true there. And it seems like from the looks of it that they liked Florida's response to the hurricane then. So a closer race that we didn't pay much attention to here at Watching Washington until election night was the Senate race in Nevada between Democrat Catherine Cortez Masto and Republican Adam Laxalt. Polls leading up to election night had Laxalt ahead, but this past Saturday night, the race was called in favor of Cortez Masto with a lead of 0.9 percentage points. Cortez Masto will also be the first Latina elected to the Senate, which was an interesting fact that I thought about as in prepping for today. And I think it's also interesting to see that we didn't talk about Nevada that much, but it was in the news more than I really expected. And I don't know. I mean, why? I don't know where I'm going with that. Yeah, it's definitely interesting how there's races leading up to the election that everyone is very focused on. But then by election day, polls are wrong at times, things change, and then it ends up being a deciding factor. And so it's definitely something to think about as journalists for ourselves, to definitely broaden our horizons when we're prepping for election coverage and make sure that we're looking everywhere, even if it might not seem like it's a close race or a race that matters. Sometimes those races turn out to be the most important. So definitely something I think we all took away, especially with other issues like marijuana and things like that, in the future, to look at all of these sides as we go forward.
And this Nevada race is the race that sealed it for the Democrats. So I think to your point, there's no way of knowing which race turns out to be the ultimate deciding race. And it was interesting to see that Nevada was the deciding state and not Georgia. Usually it comes down to Georgia. It came down to Georgia in 2020 for the Democrats maintaining control of the Senate. So it was very surprising to me. What was also surprising to me is that, honestly, I was surprised that Cortez Masto won it in the end, is because, and the reason for that is because every time I checked the Nevada race, Laxalt was winning. The Republican candidate, Adam Laxalt, was winning. And it wasn't until they called the Nevada race that Cortez Masto won, and I was like, literally, I was shocked. And I went back and looked at the votes, and she had come back to win. Yeah, and I was actually very surprised by that. I bet the Democrats are ecstatic about that, as it did get them control of the Senate for another term. So yeah, to your point, every Senate race is just as important. You never know which one is the deciding one.
Yeah.
And that Senate race was one that we didn't talk about a lot, but the one that we did talk about a lot was Oz and Fetterman. So do you want to talk a little bit more about Oz and Fetterman?
This race definitely intrigued me a little bit more than others. The high-profile Senate race in Pennsylvania between Dr. Mehmet Oz and the Democratic Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman was among the first of Senate races called in these midterms, actually. Fetterman came out on top, which helped the Dems maintain control of the Senate. So what are your guys' thoughts on that Pennsylvania race, and what are your thoughts on the two candidates?
Definitely didn't think it would be one of the first races called.
No, I didn't. No, I mean, I think that was a really surprising race, and it was really interesting to kind of watch it up to, election night and on to see what happened with it. I mean, we talked about it, and I really don't think I had an answer on, what I thought was going to happen.
Yeah, it was very up in the air. I actually did for the course. I actually wrote a paper for this course on the Oz Fetterman Pennsylvania race, and each candidate had their pros and each candidate had their cons. And this race was very characterized by the two candidates highlighting each other's cons. Fetterman, an issue that Oz cited a lot was his health and his history with strokes, and an issue that Dr. Oz had that Fetterman pointed out a lot was the fact that he didn't live in Pennsylvania for as long as Fetterman did. And Fetterman believed that Oz didn't live in Pennsylvania for long enough to be qualified to run for senator in Pennsylvania, as Oz did move to Pennsylvania in 2020 from New Jersey, and then a year later he announced his candidacy for the Senate. So bottom line is a lot of that race was characterized on Oz and Fetterman basically attacking each other in the media. And I think that's one of the contributing factors that made that race so close.
Why?
The fact that Oz and Fetterman were going at it in the media.
Just watching it.
And it really put voters in kind of a unique, interesting situation. Because Pennsylvania has always been kind of a purple state, very swing-ish state. And I think this race was very reflective of that nature of the state of Pennsylvania, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, I should say.
And also speaking on the fact that we've discussed celebrities, running more for like in these races and getting more involved in politics. And we'll talk about it more too with the Georgia race, but how that has an effect on voters. And so like studying this and watching this, like what do you think about celebrities, getting involved?
Yeah, I think it seems like so far celebrities had been pretty successful with their political runs, but I think Oz's campaign and ultimate loss through the midterms shows that celebrities are not as infallible as we often think. And, it plays a factor for name recognition, but Fetterman also had name recognition in the state of Pennsylvania that was really important too. So I think it definitely just made me want to watch even more the impact that celebrities have, and it'll be interesting with Herschel Walker to see ultimately what his impact has. But the big thing that I want to know out of this Pennsylvania race is what Fetterman is going to wear in the Senate. So I'll definitely be watching that too.
We question.
You know what I did see? I did see Fetterman pose for a picture with Chuck Schumer as part of his introduction into the Senate, rather. Yeah. And he was in a suit and a tie.
He was. Okay.
So I'm interested in seeing if that was just because it was his first time on the Senate floor, first time meeting leader Chuck Schumer, or if that's what he's going to do going forward. But I kind of like the hoodie look.
I kind of think so too.
I
Sometimes
think
makes it more relatable to the everyday person.
Yeah. So before we get into the Georgia race, I first want to touch on one of the key races that I kind of discussed during the election night broadcast, which was the Arizona race between Democrat and Senator Mark Kelly and the Trump-backed candidate Republican Blake Masters. And this was one of the races that I feel was pretty close from the beginning. Discussing it prior to the election night and seeing the polls, they did always have Kelly in the lead, but I think towards the end it was kind of up in the air on the fact that Blake Masters could potentially come back and beat him. And although we didn't get the results during the broadcast, Kelly did end up winning that race with a vote of 51.4% compared to Masters, who had 46.5%. And talking on this race, I mentioned before that, Mark Kelly, he was a former astronaut in the military involved. He also, his wife, Gabby Giffords, was a congresswoman, she's a retired congresswoman now who suffered a traumatic brain injury after an attempted assassination. So I think that, studying that and, doing our papers on that, I kind of wondered how that would have an effect on voters turning out. His name was kind of more popular. And Arizona, I don't know if you guys think, I feel like it could be considered, like a battleground state.
Yeah. For sure.
Yeah. So
it was in the 2020 election. Not only Arizona, but Georgia and Pennsylvania and Nevada. They were all battleground states in the 2020 election between Biden and Trump. And they have proven again to be battleground states in these 2022 midterms, especially for the Senate. Let's see. Pennsylvania, the Democrats picked up that state. Georgia, Democrats, Raphael Warnock is leading in that state, although it is going to a runoff. Mark Kelly that won Arizona for the Democrats, and Cortez Masto won it for the Democrats in Nevada. So we're seeing a similar trend in the midterms for the Senate as we did in 2020 with all four of those states going blue to Biden. So that can be very telling for 2024 and even beyond, I think.
Yeah, I think it's definitely interesting, too, what's behind the name. We mentioned that the Republican candidate was backed by Trump. The Democrat candidate obviously has a lot of name recognition too. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in the next 2 years as far as who backs who and who supports who, as well as whether it was the issues at play or whether it was the people behind their name that was at play. It's really hard to tell. And we might get some more insight into that as they do exit polling about the midterms and what issues were most important. But definitely interesting to think about if the issues had the bigger impact or if the names had the bigger impact as well.
And you bring up the names and people endorsing them. A huge place where that occurred was Ohio. And author J.D. Vance, he won, and now he gets a chance to write his own history. We've been following our neighbor Ohio and their Senate race very closely this midterm election. Republican J.D. Vance ended up coming out victorious against Democrat Tim Ryan. And according to CNBC, Tim Ryan spent nearly 4 times more on funding than J.D. Vance did. It's a lot of times. And when you Google J.D. Vance, the headlines literally read Trump endorsed candidate or Trump endorsed J.D. Vance. So it looked like that quote unquote Trump bump helped Vance take that very tight race. We talk about name recognition and we talked about Pennsylvania and Oz, and Oz has national or maybe even international name recognition, but it matters about the state and people voting. And I think it came down to that in Ohio as well, where Tim Ryan spent nearly $48 million compared to J.D. Vance's, I think it was 9, and he lost, and he ended up. It was fairly close, but it was convincing enough to the point where you got to raise the question: was Trump worth nearly $31 million in campaign funding, or did J.D. Vance just work behind the scenes or something like that?
And I think it's also reflective of the role that Joe Biden and Donald Trump both played in the midterms for their prospective parties' candidates. Their name does carry a lot of weight, and it showed in Ohio and I think every other race in the nation. Biden and Trump's 2020 race, I feel like, was so impactful for a lot of people in 2020. And I think that Biden and Trump understood that. They knew that. And I think they tried to use that to their advantage to help their parties out. And I think we kind of see that in races like in Ohio, races like in Pennsylvania and elsewhere around the country. Their names carry a lot of weight. And I think that Biden and Trump also understand that these midterms have just as much of an impact on them as they do anybody else. Like these midterms have influenced whether or not Trump decides to rerun, which ultimately he did decide to rerun. And it'll also be very telling to see how Biden decides whether or not he's going to run or not. These midterms definitely did have an impact on Biden and Trump, and I think they understood that, and I think that's why they had as big of a role as they each had for their respective parties.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting too how voter opinions on Biden or Trump-backed candidates probably varied between state to state.
And we've been talking about northern states a lot. Let's talk about the main southern state that everyone's been watching and that I've been watching very closely, which is Georgia. And Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock continue to make headlines as they've had this entire race. And like I said, this is going into a runoff. Democrat incumbent Raphael Warnock once again finds himself in a runoff as he won his runoff 2 years ago. Neither candidate reached over 50% of the votes, which is required to avoid a runoff. Libertarian Chase Oliver took 2.1% of the vote, which played a major factor in this race going to a runoff. So this runoff will now just be Walker and Warnock as the only candidates when it comes time to vote again December 9th. The main question that I'm going to ask is who's going to have this edge going into December? It's a 4-week period where things can change. Could it be the former Georgia Bulldog and former Heisman Trophy winner, Walker, who will most likely see his alma mater play for an SEC championship just 3 days before the election? And I know it kind of sounds like a joke, but football down there is very different. Or will it be the prominent religious figure, Raphael Warnock, as we get closer to the holiday season, where there is an increase in the amount of churchgoers? These are two factors that might not be talked about quite a bit, but could play a huge factor. If Georgia wins a national championship and let's say Herschel Walker's on the field, I don't know, waving to fans, whatever it is, that could be a huge, huge name recognition for him. Raphael Warnock coming up on Christmas season or other holiday seasons, people might feel inclined to go with the religious figure there. or just the Democrat incumbent. So I'm curious to see how this runoff is going to play.
And you even mentioned before the fact that, Walker's name had been in the media more leading up to, the elections, and not for good reasons, really. And so do you think that that could still have an effect on what happens?
Yeah, I mean, looking at the midterm elections, most fringe states went blue, and I think it's hard to ignore the fact that Roe v. Wade was one of the main questions. So abortion is a main topic in America, and if it's a main topic in Georgia, then I think that's going to seal the race for Warnock because, like you mentioned with allegations, Herschel Walker has been in the media twice this race for him not forcing but encouraging abortions for women, and he is now against abortion. So it's kind of hard to see. Just 25 years ago, he was all for it when it was good for him, and now he's opposing it as a Republican. So I think it's going to come down to abortion, like most of these elections have come down to. But it's Herschel Walker in the media again, which is no sight that we've not seen.
And I think that in Georgia in particular, it's definitely going to come down to that 2.1% of the vote that went to the Libertarian candidate.
Yeah.
We have no idea what political backgrounds that those 2.1% of Georgians have. Yeah, they might identify as Libertarian or identified with the Libertarian candidate, but does that mean that they lean more conservative Libertarian or liberal Libertarian?
Yeah.
And that'll influence whether they vote for the Democrat Warnock, the Republican Walker, or just not vote at all. I mean, that is such a wild card in this Georgia runoff.
Yeah.
And
So true.
I think that's one of the most intriguing aspects of that runoff, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it shakes out.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what issues they focus on as it comes up. Whether Trump and Biden get involved, I'm sure they will. But you raised such a good point, too, about the context of the runoff with football and Christmas time. I mean, all very important factors. And a lot of times, like we've talked about tonight, there's big issues that we focus on, but it's really important, too, to think about the context and the libertarian vote and all those factors that could be at play. So we've covered a lot of the races that we've been watching the past few weeks. But Avik, do you want to tell us more about the overall outlook of the House and the Senate right now?
Yeah, so off the top, we mentioned that the GOP appears poised to obtain control of the House of Representatives, but there are still plenty of races that have yet to be called. Many were expecting a red wave of at least 20 seats to go red in the House, maybe 25, but Democrats exceeded expectations through their performance in the House, flipping at least 8 seats, making it a close contest in the House of Representatives. So what are your guys' reactions to how well the Democrats did in the House?
I mean, I don't want to lie and say I'm not surprised. I'm fairly surprised. It's really easy to be on air and say, "Oh, I'm not surprised," but no, I'm very surprised. There's so many things that went blue or went closer than expected. I'm surprised there's a runoff in Georgia, and I'm gonna most likely be surprised by the result, whichever happens, because like you said, that 2.1% is gonna play a huge factor. I'm surprised that everything is still. I'm using surprised a lot, but I'm very surprised. There's so many things that are unknown, and was it Roe v. Wade? Was it the economy? Was it marijuana in some states? It's hard to really pinpoint and who won the election. Was it Pennsylvania? Was it Nevada? It's really hard to point. So it's really cool to research about, because I don't think anyone will really know what sealed the deal or what didn't seal the deal, and it's really cool to follow.
That's what makes this so exciting.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, that's what makes doing this so exciting. That's what made election night so exciting for us to be a part of. For me to be a part of personally, is that there are so many unknowns in elections, in politics as a whole, and regardless of how someone might feel about a certain issue or which way someone might lean, at the end of the day, this is democracy at work. And I know it sounds so cliche, especially from an anchor saying it on the air, but this is democracy at work. This is what makes our nation keep moving forward. This is what has kept our nation moving forward for the past 2 centuries. So every election cycle, I always geek out, nerd out, because there are so many, like you said, there's so many unknowns, and I don't know, I just feel like I'm here for it all.
Yeah. And I think it just shows, the importance of the midterms. And as we've discussed, what's happened in these midterm elections, from the House to the Senate, and some of these key races and key issues. The next question is, what will history remember from these midterms?
Tough question.
It is a tough
that's a really good
A
question.
lot of things.
You could look at it multiple different ways. I think the main topic is going to be Roe v. Wade, but it's marijuana is still a very new thing, and who knows what's going to happen with that in 20 years. Or we've talked about gun violence, we've talked about the economy, we've talked about. I think this is the first time that we've seen like a really big impact on celebrities, whether it's endorsements or people running. So I'm really excited to see. I know Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson has said things, and Matthew McConaughey has said many things.
Mhm.
I'm curious to see how the impact of celebrities are going to be moving forward. And I think everything is changing, and it's going to be cool watching everything change.
Mhm.
One thing I take away, and I think history will take away as well, is the voter turnout.
Yeah.
It met, if not exceeded, 2018's voter turnout, which already set a record.
Mhm.
So, and also going back to the 2020 election, where that saw also a record turnout. So I think that one thing that history will take away from these midterms is that more people, I should say, are finally investing themselves in their democracy.
Yeah.
And a lot more people have been impacted by things that have happened in our country, and it shows by the record turnout that we've seen in these midterms in the 2020 election. So I think one thing that history will take away from this is that more and more people are starting to get involved in our government.
Mhm.
And on top of that, the drawback, I guess, is that our government is still divided. Another thing that history might take from this is that our government is still divided. Mitch McConnell said it on the Senate floor. The American people chose a very divided government, which means that, objectively, the Senate is still virtually 50-50. The House is virtually 50-50. So I think that, more people are getting involved in record numbers. And on top of that, people are growing further apart. And I think that some things we need to keep in mind are encouraging people to stay involved while also inspiring more respect, more openness to ideas. I feel like
That's a good point.
both of those things are so crucial to our nation, and they're going to keep our nation moving for another 2 centuries.
Yeah, which you bring up, a few good points there. One with, the voter turnout, and that, being something that they're going, people are probably going to remember from this midterm election. As we've seen, midterm elections aren't usually that popular when it comes to voter turnout. They usually have less of a turnout. And, this year was different. Numbers keep going up. And so, that is, I agree. I think that is something that people will take away from this midterm election. And then getting into your next point, I think that kind of goes into, looking forward to 2024 and a divided government. And, what's at stake?
Juntong, do you want to touch on that?
I think
About going forward and what we see.
Let's talk about the 2024. And just this week, as we expected, Donald Trump announces a White House bid for the 2024 presidential election. According to the Ballotpedia, President Joe Biden will run for presidency for 2024, and also Vice President Kamala Harris will also be one of the candidates in 2024. What do you guys think about that?
I think it's definitely interesting. Not really surprised by former President Donald Trump's decision to run. Will definitely be interesting to watch for more sources than Ballotpedia on whether Joe Biden runs again or whether Kamala Harris runs again. As we've talked about, it's going to be interesting over the next 2 years to see how America likes the divided government, what policies move forward, what don't, because that will determine the policies important to voters in 2024. But I think going forward, it's an area for opportunity for both sides. Both need to do some reflecting and look at what areas they've got to capture and improve going into 2024. For Republicans, they need to work on the youth vote, most likely, and Democrats maybe capturing some libertarians that have gone back and forth between both parties. But it will definitely be interesting. I think Florida's rallying around Ron DeSantis is interesting, as he's been talked about often as a potential 2024 candidate. As of right now, he's not announcing anything, but his team has said, in the future could be a possibility. So definitely, as far as candidates go, that's an area I'm watching.
Mm-hmm.
And presidential candidates is a conversation that has a lot of names. I mean, Vice President Kamala Harris says she wants to run. If Joe Biden plans on running, there's one right there. We've talked about Trump. We've talked about DeSantis. Who's going to be their vice? Like, who's gonna be their vice president? There's going to be so many names being thrown around in these next 2 years, and I'm so curious to see where these direction goes. Or let's say if Biden runs and Kamala steps down, and I'll do vice president again, or will Ron DeSantis be Trump's vice president? There's going to be a lot that I'm very curious to see what's going to happen, because there's a lot of names being thrown around very early, might I add.
And it just makes me think of how the 2020 primaries were, and the 2016 primaries were, with President Obama being the outgoing president, with both parties having primaries as a result.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many big names and a lot of big egos. You see a lot of even in the Democratic primary of 2020, with that big pool of Democrats. We saw Kamala Harris attacking Joe Biden for his record, and Joe Biden doing the same thing with Kamala Harris, and all of a sudden Kamala Harris becomes his running mate and vice president. So that's something that intrigues me a lot, is that I'm interested in seeing how the Republican primaries go with Trump and DeSantis and other prospective Republican candidates, and how they interact with each other on the debate stage. And in turn, who the successful candidate chooses as their running mate. And vice versa in the Democratic Party, if there is a primary in that party. How are the candidates going to interact with each other, and who will the winner choose as his or her running mate? Will be very telling.
And I think that, we bring up a lot of good points on, going forward and what's going to happen. And there's really just a lot of questions. So really, we're just going to have to, wait and see what happens. And that's going to be it for us today. We hope that you enjoyed our show, and we will continue to bring you the latest updates on what's happening in Washington and on the midterm elections, because they're not really done yet. So thank you for watching. I'm Gabriella Chu. Have a great day.